As I said, when we started the idea to create this conference, the first call we made was to Andrew Solomon, and we were very pleased that he agreed to come and spend lunch with us. I have to say I have a Facebook group of all my former students from here and from Penn, and they have never been more impressed with me in my entire career than knowing that I'm going to be interviewing you today. So they all send their best.
Good, thank you.
I'm going to read Andrew's bio to you, which doesn't include the Noonday Demon, which is very typical of authors talking about their more recent project. Andrew is a professor of clinical psychology at Columbia University Medical Center, past president of PEN American Center. He's a writer and lecturer on psychology, politics, and the arts, and an activist in LGBT rights, mental health, and the arts. Writes regularly for The New Yorker and The Times. His book, Far from the Tree, Parents, Children, and the Search for Identity, won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction, and was chosen as one of the New York Times 10 best books of 2012. Subsequent book, Far and Away, How Travel Can Change the World, was published in 2016 and has been named a New York Times notable book and won the ITB Award for travel writing. Most recently, he made an award-winning film, Far from the Tree, available on Hulu and elsewhere, and an audio series called New Family Values, which is available on Audible. He lives with his husband and son in New York and London, and as a dual national, he also has a daughter with a college friend. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Solomon. So, as I note, there's no mention of the Noonday Demon and no mention of your mental health work, but we're going to talk to you about that first, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So, I think that whenever somebody writes a book like The Noonday Demon, especially a book as heavy as The Noonday Demon, and I will say that I have back pains from carrying around your two books recently.
A friend of mine actually said to me, your book is so good I can't put it down, but unfortunately I also can't pick it up.
But since many people here are at the point that you were at when you were ill, thinking about what to do with that experience, and whether they should write about it or never talk about it again. I would like you to talk a little bit about the experience of writing your first piece for The New Yorker about this, your choice even in doing it, and what came after it for you.
Well, when the Depression hit, which was in 1994, I'd had minor precursor episodes that I can recognize in retrospect, but the really disabling depression came in 94. And at the lowest point of it, I was not writing anything. I was curled up in a ball on my bed with my head under the pillow, wishing I were dead. So that was not a highly productive time. But in the period that followed, as I began eventually to emerge from that most serious and awful stretch, I started taking notes on the experience that I'd had, mostly really at that point as a way of making order out of my experience, because I felt that if the experience could be made into some kind of order, that it would become more, more possible to endure it, more possible to make some kind of sense of it. And then I began reading through my own notes, and I thought, even though I was still not 100%, I thought I would like to do this for The New Yorker. I had done some other writing there and had an editor I liked working with. I felt a number of things. In the first place, I had been trying to read everything that I could, and I felt like there was not a book like the one that I had imagined, or an article like the one that I had imagined. But also I just feel like the stigma has caused people to remain in the closet about their experiences with mental illness, and for good reason. There are plenty of places in which people with mental illness experience extreme prejudice. But I thought the only way that the stigma will ever be reduced is for more people to open up and talk about it. And I think also I had gone through the experience of coming out of the closet as a gay man, and I had a sense that I didn't like closets and that I didn't like being in a situation in which I thought, well, these people know, but do those people know? And I told this one, and perhaps she told the other one, and so on and so forth. I felt like whatever was happening, I didn't want to go around with another secret that people could go about discovering. So I had a sense of kind of publicness about it. And I started the piece by talking to Kay Jamison, whom you'll hear from later, who was a mentor and an inspiration. And she invited me to my first scientific conference about mental health, much of which was slightly over my head, but which was nonetheless really a gripping and amazing conference to come to. It was about suicide. And I felt that there was a place for trying to put together my experience and describe really what it was like in my own language and the experience of other people, and to try to describe what they were going through. And then the article came out, and then the first week after it came out, I received over 1,000 letters from people writing in to tell me about their own experience. And I thought, well, there's scope to make something bigger of this.
So what I'm interested in about that original piece and about the book is that I do think it seamlessly brings together your own experiences, your interviews with other regular people, and the kind of interviews you do with experts that are very hard to make interesting. And I know some of those conferences. Kay took me to some of those conferences during the 90s as well. And the challenge is that you hear all these things at these conferences. Maybe you understand them, maybe you don't. But I do think as a reporter, weaving that together is still something that I think people find incredibly hard. I think it's probably easier for people not as well to write about their own experiences, but to be open as to go back and forth between their own experiences, other people's experiences, and the science.
Well, I felt as though there was a kind of chaos in the kingdom. I thought that there were very good psychodynamic texts about depression and where it might come from. And I thought that there were excellent memoirs to be found. And I thought that there were obviously scientific papers to be read, and so on and so forth. And there were interview-based books. But there was nothing that pulled it all together in a single place. I actually think that the content of scientific conferences, though not always presented in the most fascinating way, is extremely interesting, and is somehow especially interesting to the very people who can't understand it as it's generally presented, because they are the ones who don't get this information. And so I felt like it was an active translation. As I went to more and more conferences and got to be more and more at ease in them and read more and more scientific papers, I felt as though the content was fascinating, and the way that it was laid out was often very professional and appropriate to the context it was in, but not very accessible. And I thought, if I can take all of these insights that exist out there and bring them to people in a way so that they can understand them, that would be a service, because I think there are so many people who want to understand their depression and want to understand medication and want to understand what depression really is and so on. But I came to the book really, and I'll talk about the book rather than the article for a moment, I came to the book really with the idea that with two ideas. In the first place, I wanted to unseat the idea of depression as a modern Western middle-class illness by showing that it's existed across societies and has existed across time and exists across the spectrum of socioeconomic status. And then I observed, as I began doing the research, that there were some people who had what sounded, as they described it, like relatively minor depression, who were nonetheless completely disabled by it, and people who had what sounded, when they described it, like much more acute depression, were able to have lives of meaning, at least in the interstices between their depressive episodes. And so I wanted to understand the mechanisms of resilience and how people come through. And then once I had that framework, that those were the questions I was asking, it took me a while to arrive at them, but once I had that framework, then it became easy to look at scientific papers and think, okay, how does that pertain to the questions I'm asking? And if the question itself is driving readers' interest, they'll get through the science in order to understand it and be exhilarated and fascinated by the science.
I'm curious about your interviewing style in these situations, both in terms of technically what you do. I mean, I know you told me with your recent book, which has many, many more interviews, that you have somebody transcribes all the interviews. Is that the way you worked back then, or were you, is that the way you've always worked? And I guess the other thing is, how do you do the interviews with the experts? Meaning, are they also really long interviews that you're ultimately cherry picking a few lines from? Or are they different kinds of interviews than the intake you would do with a patient or a family member that you were going to write about?
Well, there are inherent differences between interviewing someone who has direct experience of mental illness, I'll stay on mental illness, but of anything else that I'm writing about, the people who are directly addressing it and the people who are experts. I mean, some of the people who are experts have also had these experiences, but in general, they're different kinds of interviews. And I feel like getting people to open up and talk about their experiences with depression is hard. It's hard to get people to be honest. A lot of people have not been honest with themselves. A lot of people feel, as I said, a great deal of stigma. A lot of people are challenged by the idea of telling their full story. And yet, once you get people started, once you've gotten them to agree to do it, I found the people I was talking to were in general so full of their story that they couldn't stop telling it. And so the interviews became very long and very detailed and very complex. And then there was the task of taking the sort of great web that is one of those interviews and distilling it. Can you distill a web? I think I've done a mixed metaphor.
Yes.
Taking the content of these conversations and distilling it into something that was narrative. In interviewing experts, I always tried to ask questions that were my questions and also the questions that I thought readers might be interested in. And some experts, many experts, I would say even most in my experience, are very generous and will give you a lot of time if you are genuinely interested in what they're doing. Some people, are very busy and they want to do it very quickly and rather dryly. But I think those interviews tend to be more structured. They tend to go from a beginning toward an end. There's an initial statement, then I have a question about it that refines further one aspect of what's been said. They're more cogent and more coherent, and they're easier to rework in some ways into the material of the book.
Sometimes when I see these interviews, it makes me wonder whether you're running your ideas past them as well, besides getting their ideas. Meaning, there are so many connections in the way you write, even to look at both sides of a situation that most journalists wouldn't. So I guess my question is, I'm sure sometimes those come from the sources telling you to do that, but I do wonder, I do sometimes think journalists don't know if it's okay in an interview setting to lay out an idea they have, which can be dangerous. It can be a crazy idea. This question might be a crazy idea. But at the same time, if they don't do it, it can show up in the piece, while they've never really said it to the person. Meaning that you could have two quotes from a person you have, the connection that you make is one that you made. So I just wonder how you deal with the connective material with your experts.
Well, I believe in fact-checking your own fact-checking. I think there can never be too much of checking. And I don't think that checking appropriately comes at the end of the process when you have a manuscript and just run it by someone. I think it comes all the way through. And if you have ideas in an area in which you don't have primary expertise, and you're talking to people who do have primary expertise, you have to tell them what your views are, you have to explain what it is that you're working from, and you have to try to get them to say, that makes perfect sense, or you're totally off base, or as most often happens, well, that's an interesting idea, but have you considered this? And, there's some merit in what you've said, but you can't write about it unless you also look at that, and so on and so forth. So I think there has to be a constant process, and you don't want to take over an interview with an expert and make it all about you rather than all about what they have to say in general, but you do want to keep over and over again testing any hypotheses that you have.
Do you try to do your interviews in person, or is it perfectly fine on the phone? Do you do email interviews?
I very much prefer doing interviews in person. I think there's a dynamic that sets in. Thank you. I think there's a dynamic that sets in when you're talking to someone in an intimacy that's established that can't be done in any other way. I'm currently working on a book, and I've done a number of interviews by Skype because I just can't travel to all of the places where people are all of the time, and that does okay, but it's helpful at least to see someone's face. I think email interviews are okay for getting factual information, but not for getting emotional information.
So just to be technical for the J School students, when you do an interview, what are you using for equipment? Are you just recording? Are you taking notes? Are you working from prepared notes, or just from your memory?
I am always recording people on...
It's cold season, sorry.
It's not a cold, it was just a little inhalation. Don't worry, I'm not infecting you all. I don't take notes, but I do record everything. I mostly record it on my iPhone. I know that that's not the smartest way to do it. I have a digital recorder as well, so I have to get to be better at using it. But I record everything, and then I have all of it transcribed. And the transcriber will often say, do you want me to transcribe the incidental conversation? And the incidental conversation, or what a transcriber perceives as incidental conversation, is often the most interesting. We don't have to have passed the salt if we were sitting at lunch, but a lot of the kind of background on kind of, why are you writing this book and what are you writing, and even my own explanation of what I'm doing to someone is useful to have on the page when I look at the way they responded. And I think, oh, well, they responded partly because on this particular day I seem to be emphasizing this aspect of what I was writing on.
So you're asking the transcriber whether they're going to transcribe what you said.
I have.
And would you describe your book?
Yes, I had them transcribe the whole conversation.
No, I think actually sometimes if journalists heard what they said when they were describing what they were doing, it would really help, because the person on the other side of that interview, sometimes it sounds great and sometimes they want to say, really? And having that really conversation, I think, is really valuable. So it sounds to me like you've run a lot of ideas past different kinds of experts, and some of them have just said, like, no, that's not it.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, it's an iterative process. So when I was writing about schizophrenia in Far From the Tree, I interviewed Jeff Lieberman up at Columbia and asked him a lot of questions because it's an area that he's worked in, and then came to some understanding, and then went back and asked him some more questions, and we had an ongoing series of conversations. There are other people who have been extremely helpful to me in writing about depression. I often think that you have to process what someone has said, and then you sometimes have to go back and say to them, okay, I think now I understand what you were saying, but that leaves me with these 4 unanswered questions. And it should be a dialogue. I mean, some people are too busy or too far away, and it can't be a sustained dialogue, but I think ideally it should be. And in writing Far From the Tree, for example, there are families who are in that book whom I interviewed once for 2 hours and who really told me their stories. And there are people whom I interviewed once every month or so over a period of almost 10 years, and because their stories kept shifting and changing and were so complicated. And both ways of addressing things are valid, and I hope that in writing the book I was able to present those stories in ways that made it unclear who had talked to me for hours and hours and who had talked to me only very briefly.
What's the difference between writing about depression and writing about schizophrenia for you?
Well, I mean, the primary difference for me is that I suffer from depression, and I don't so far suffer from schizophrenia. So I can't write autobiographically about schizophrenia, and I don't feel that my understanding of it is as profound as my understanding of depression, you know, however profound that may be. But it's also that depression affects so many more people, and I have yet to meet anyone who hasn't been affected by depression, if not their own depression, then by the depression of someone they know or someone they care about or someone they feel a connection to. You know, it's ubiquitous. People are still so terrified of schizophrenia. Most people seem to believe they've ever met anyone with schizophrenia, despite the relatively significant prevalence in the population. And you have to explain to people what it is and what it's like and what the medications can do, and you have to go through a whole process of kind of explicating the disease that you don't have to do with depression. Also, of course, most people think they know what depression is because they have occasionally felt sad, and they say, oh yes, you know, I got really depressed when my dog died. And you have to work through with them, what does it mean to be sad? What does it mean to be depressed? How do you distinguish between those two things? My kind of trademark line that the opposite of depression is not happiness but vitality, and to try to explain to people what depression is in that regard. With schizophrenia, most people have no sense of ever having been affected by psychosis, and, as I say, are terrified and bewildered by it.
Is it easy? I guess the question I wanted to ask is if you had to write about depression without it being something you experienced. I mean, in a way, writing about schizophrenia is like writing about depression without having experienced it. And I think that many people who do journalism in this area and also who write, who are clinicians, have to deal with how to make descriptions that are powerful without invoking themselves. I mean, one of the challenges for most people is if they can't go to themselves as a way of describing something, how to make it have the same kind of power. So I guess you probably never thought about this because you have depression, maybe bipolar disorder, which is a little different, but how do you evoke the same power if you can't go to yourself?
Well, you can go to other people, and I think it's capturing the voices of people who are directly affected. When I was writing about schizophrenia, I interviewed a lot of people with schizophrenia. I interviewed a lot of parents of people who had developed schizophrenia, and I interviewed a lot of doctors. But the stories of the people who had schizophrenia, I mean, I was surprised given the negative symptoms of schizophrenia and how it can interfere with human connectedness, I was surprised how much people were willing to tell me, often very, very painful things. And not only people who had been successfully medicated and no longer had a lot of symptoms of schizophrenia, some people who were in an ongoing process of dealing with a kind of haunting psychosis and the hearing of voices and so on, who really talked about it and who wanted to talk about it. And it was very difficult and very painful for them. But when I talked to them about why they had chosen to tell stories in that vivid, profound way and really give a narrative of their experience, they said over and over again, we are so lonely in what we experience, and it would be so great if other people were less lonely, and if telling you the story means someone else will feel a little less alone in what they experience, then I'm okay to tell you the story. And so despite the sort of reputation of people with schizophrenia as being very disconnected, they wanted that connection and they wanted to bring that sense of purposefulness to what they did. The tenor is necessarily different than the tenor of autobiography, but I think if you can get people really to talk honestly that their stories, other people's stories are at least as powerful as mine, maybe more so.
How do you do the reporting? A lot of the families that you talk to at least partly get it, right? The fact that you're talking to them, they probably have some knowledge and understanding and sympathy. But of course, there's a whole world of families that don't. So your writing now is so focused on family dynamics. And people with these illnesses and people who write about these illnesses, one of the things that they talk about is the difficulty not just of writing about the person with the illness, but to really understand the family dynamics and how they play through for the person with the illness, especially in families where there's still a very steep if any, learning curve. And I think that a number of the journalism students here deal with those kinds of stories. So I'm wondering if you can give us some advice on penetrating families that aren't so helpful.
My first bit of advice would be to say there are a lot of families out there, and plenty of them are helpful. And if you find one who's really unhelpful and closed, you can move on and find another one. It's not as though these are unbelievably rare diseases, and if you don't find the person who has Knist syndrome, you'll never find anyone else with Knist syndrome again. But I think also people are very afraid of being judged. They're very afraid of your coming in and portraying them, even if you're doing so pseudonymously, in ways that would be upsetting to them or that would cause further rifts within their families. There's an immense vulnerability to telling these stories, and I think what people need is reassurance that that vulnerability is not going to be exploited in a damaging or dangerous way. It's a process getting people to open up. The other thing is to give it time. I said a little while ago that there were people I had interviewed once a month for 10 years. The first interviews I did with those people, they didn't give me everything that I wanted. That's why I stuck with it over a long period of time. Often, if you are willing to build a relationship with someone, the more they trust you, the more open they'll be. And nobody trusts anyone immediately after meeting them, no matter what their CV says or what their previous accomplishments may be.
What areas of mental illness and addiction do you think we're not writing about enough?
Well, I think we're not writing enough about mental illness and addiction. I think there's a real need to write a great deal more about it. And I'm cheered that there are so many people in this room who are contemplating doing that in one way or another. Are there particular conditions we don't write about enough, or are there particular ways of writing that we don't do enough? I think we don't do enough to look at the ways in which these conditions define people's identities. We tend to write about them from an illness standpoint. They also occupy an identity standpoint. I think it's important that the illness and identity standpoints be reconciled in one way or another. And I think it's crucial that we recognize the humanity and the dignity of the people who are experiencing these conditions. And I'm just thinking while I'm talking, not always a good idea, but about the things that aren't covered enough. I think we're doing better with schizophrenia and with psychotic disorders. I think the opioid crisis has forced us into more open conversation about addiction and the people who are affected by it. I feel like there are areas in which there's intense conflict. I mean, in the autism community, you have all of these people who are saying, my autism is not an illness, it's just a different neurological wiring, and the neurological wiring of people with autism is an important part of human diversity, and attempts to cure autism are genocidal, and attempts to wipe out this segment of the population. I think that politics is a complicated one, and mostly people write from one side or the other. They're either saying all autistic people have an identity and we should be allowed to live in our identity, or they're saying those people are only making the best of a bad situation, and if we could cure their autism, they would all jump at the opportunity. And the reality lies somewhere in between those two, and the difficulty, I think, is to express both points of view in a single piece of writing.
It's so interesting you talk about identity politics, because I do think that many people with mental illness say that they don't want it to be their identity. But you've written, especially in your more recent book, about people with conditions where it is their identity. So I guess, I would love to hear you elaborate just on the idea of, sometimes are you trying to show somebody as a gay man that maybe the fact that they're depressed is part of their identity? I mean, I'm just fishing here, but you raise the question, and I think it really it underlies a lot of the judgments that journalists make, small judgments in stories, the questions that they ask people. The disease model is by definition saying to people, this is not your identity, this is a disease. It's oversimplification, but those oversimplifications are what we write about. So I would love to hear you elaborate on this idea a little bit more. It seems really germane to a lot of different kinds of writing.
Well, I think, and perhaps I've made this mistake myself in my answer to your last question, I think it's always both. I mean, being depressed is an identity. I know a lot of people, because I'm depressed, or have been depressed, I'm sitting up here on this podium, or stage, rather, because I've been depressed. I have friends who I think of as my depression friends. There's a lot that comes to you from having these experiences. I also think that the kind of depression that I had, the extreme clinical depression, was for me an illness, and if there were a way to make it disappear so that I would never hear from it again, I would leap at the opportunity. I think often people set up an opposition in which they're saying either rah-rah, mad pride, or they're saying this horrible thing and how can we get rid of it. And I think the point is just to understand that for the people who have it, I mean, if I suddenly didn't have depression, that would be a shift in my identity. It's one that I would welcome at this particular moment. Having said that, I think that the experience of being depressed was enormously influential in my intellectual awakening, in my engagement with science, in my areas of interest, and I wouldn't give up the depression that's in my past. I would give up the depression that's in my future. And I think it's important for people to be able to understand that point of view.
How is your health? Is it okay to ask?
It's fine to ask. My health is sort of all right at the moment, but I definitely still deal with depression. I take a lot of medication. I'm in psychotherapy. My psychopharmacologist spoke to you earlier this morning, Richard Friedman.
I did my best not to introduce him as Andrew Solomon's psychopharmacologist.
He's a genius, and has done a remarkable job of helping me to function as well as I.
Did you meet him through an interview?
No.
Okay.
I met him through clinical things, but we've become good friends since then.
Anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt. So how's your health?
So my health is, it's fine today. I think when you suffer from one of these conditions, that's sort of the best you can say. It's fine today. It's been fine the last few weeks. I hope it will go on being fine for a while. It goes up and down. I have better days. I have worse days. I have days when I feel on top of everything. I have days when I don't. There's a real range of experience.
In the updated version of Noonday Demon, you offered a new chapter that talked about some of your more recent treatment as well as a lot of other things. And about your change in medication. Was that, I think when you talked on the phone about that, you had been on medications for 15 years, and then you had the change. That in and of itself is an unbelievably dramatic thing for anybody who has these illnesses. I think that we don't often cover well enough the challenge of medications, the challenge of changing medications, the fear of changing medications, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I had a severe depression about a year ago, and when I went to Richard to talk about it, he said that he thought that I should come off the Zoloft and Remeron that I was taking and start taking Cymbalta instead. And I was very frightened by the idea of coming off, as you've just said, of coming off the Zoloft and the Remeron, which I had been on for 15 years and which had worked pretty well for me for 15 years, but which were suddenly not working very well. You know, and I thought, is this really a depression that will respond to medication, or is this a depression that is now, I mean, it's part of the illness. You think, no, it's just who I am now, and I'm going to feel this way forever, and I just have to make the most of it, and going off these medications that have helped me will only make it worse. And I had wobbly faith, even though I have enormous esteem for Richard, I had wobbly faith in the whole science of depression. And I thought, okay, I know this intellectually. I've written about this. I know that people can make switches in medications and get better. I know there are other options if one doesn't get better. I know there are ways through. There was a period a year ago when I couldn't see them. But in fact, we made that medication switch in the spring, and I've been much, much better since then. And he was right. But the treatment for these conditions is a trauma. It's very time consuming. I feel like it eats up a lot of my time. I feel like the conditions eat up a lot of time. I feel like the whole process takes up time, and there are these moments of despair. And I wish the fact that I'd written a whole book about how you can be depressed and find meaning in your experience meant that I didn't feel despair. You know, I find the meaning, but I'm also miserable.
I'm interested, you've obviously done a lot writing on other subjects since Noonday Demon, but I think that sometimes people don't appreciate the sheer volume of writing you still do on mental health in smaller ways. Not smaller, I mean, the pieces are great and they're all over the place, and I would say that anybody who loves a book that somebody writes always wishes that the person would keep writing about the thing if they move on to another subject. So what I would say is, first of all, if you haven't looked at Andrew's archives on his website, they're all up there for free, and he's been doing an enormous number of pieces. I wanted to talk about one that I think was so powerful and so corrective, and the kind of thing that just reminded me what journalism can do and doesn't do enough. And that's the piece that you did on Adam Lance's father, which I think, besides being an amazing piece, is an example of the kind of piece that I think people think can't exist. That there can't be an in-depth piece that really takes you into the thing that everybody has worked through in their minds and made up whatever they think actually happened a million times, and to really bring reporting, detail, sympathy, power. If you've never read the piece, you should read it. It's amazing. And could you talk a little bit about it? Because I really think in many ways it is the quintessential thing that we always need when there are mental health crises in the news, on TV, and there are very few people who can bring all that together, within a year of the thing happening, and really make sense of it and move the story forward.
When I was writing Far From the Tree, I included a chapter on the families of people who commit crimes. And I was very struck, as I did the research for that book, by the fact that we used to say that autism was caused by refrigerator mothers, and we've sort of finally dropped that. And we used to say schizophrenia was caused by parents who nurtured an unconscious wish that their child not exist, and we've got over that. And we used to say people were gay because they had overbearing mothers and passive fathers, and so on and so forth. There was a whole litany of these things in which the parents were consistently blamed for the child's identity or pathology. And we've dropped that in all those areas, but we have not dropped it in the realm of crime. And we still think, if we read about a crime, we think, I wonder what went on in that kid's household when he was a child. I wonder how he ended up being that sort of person. In our household, where we bring our children up properly, that could never happen. And so I wrote a chapter about families of people who commit crimes in Far From the Tree. Now, there are some people who have got a vulnerability to criminal behavior, in whom that vulnerability is exacerbated or even activated by an abusive home life. But there are also a lot of people who are inclined toward criminality, who come from families that have been very loving and very supportive, and who remain entirely bewildered by what happens. And so I wrote about the family of Dylan Klebold, who was one of the perpetrators of the Columbine massacre. I spent time in working in a prison for a while so that I could get to know a bunch of juvenile felons and interview their families. And it was on the basis of that writing that Peter Lanza got in touch with me and said, I'm thinking about telling my story, and I think you would be the right person to tell it to.
So he just called you or emailed you?
Yes. And I thought, this is such a dark story. And I mean, back to the previous topic, how likely is it that if I plunge myself into the story, it will make me depressed? But I also thought it was an extraordinary opportunity to tell a story that people needed to hear. And I didn't yet at that point know that I would like Peter Lanza, as indeed I finally did. But I thought it seemed from our initial interaction as though he was trying his hardest to understand what had happened and trying to make amends in any way he could. And he too said that the reason for telling his story was that he wanted to be helpful to people who were trying to understand what happened and to give whatever information he had in order to do so. And I ended up spending, an enormous amount of time with Peter and his wife, Shelley. We were together most weekends over the course of 3 or 4 months. And they gradually told their story, and I tried to interweave it with this narrative that criminal behavior is not necessarily the result of a poor upbringing. But I also saw so much pain in him. He was so horrified by what had happened. And I said to him at one point, well, do you think you should have done such and such instead of so and so? And he said, I think anything I did differently would have had to produce a better result, because there is no worse result than what happened. And I felt like that sort of sense of self-blame and pain was so enormous in him, and I thought he was very courageous to discuss it with me, and I wanted to be true to his experience as much as I could.
And that was issued as an ebook.
Yes, it was in the New Yorker originally, and then issued as an ebook.
Do you think that there's a way to do that kind of journalism on more of these cases, so that that's kind of piece isn't the exception, but in fact, at a certain point, it becomes more the rule? I mean, I know in magazines, it's like at the end of a year, sometimes you get the opportunity to go back to something. But he reached out to you far earlier than a year, because it was published at a year, right?
It was published later than a year.
Maybe it said in the piece that he reached out to you at the anniversary. I mean, is it possible to get that kind of depth in these situations and we're just not looking for it because we aren't willing to be sympathetic or even ask the questions broadly?
Well, yes, I think sometimes. I think people want a sympathetic audience, and they want an audience they feel will give them a fair hearing. I mean, that doesn't mean that you don't describe their shortcomings and their errors and their problems. And I don't think you have to sort of guarantee people, I'd like to write about you, but I'm only going to say nice things about you. You can't go into it from that point of view. You have to say, I'm interested in discovering what the story is. I'm going to do the research broadly. I want to hear your story. I'm then going to have to put together whatever I've heard with whatever I find elsewhere. It was striking to me. Peter Lanza, I think, was as rigorously honest as he possibly could be. He's not a highly introspective man by character, but he really plunged in as deep as he could. I tried to call the psychiatrist at Yale, who had seen Adam Lanza a couple of years before Newtown occurred, and had said that he was in sound mental health, and I got snowed with kind of press office forms and so on and so forth. I mean, there was this enormous resistance there. So where the resistance is going to be can vary enormously, and sometimes it's people who are more worried about saving their own skin than people who are worried about the vulnerability of admitting to the difficulties they've encountered.
The father can't ask for the kid's records after the kid is dead, right? Maybe the father can't ask for the kid's records, period.
Which records? For
the treatment records, if Yale wouldn't help you, but...
Oh, there are ways he couldn't, but the people investigating the episode could.
Oh, right. Right, okay. So let's talk a little bit. The assumption is many of us who write about mental health have editors who occasionally look at us and go, didn't we already do depression? Haven't we already covered this? Our assumption is that if we were you, we would never have that question. And that anything you'd want to write about, you could write about no matter how depressing it is.
Life is a matter of laughter and song.
So I'm wondering what your experiences are with editors being continually interested in these subjects.
I always think of when I was writing for the Times Magazine, and I had proposed doing a story about depression among the indigent, and they had accepted the assignment, and I went off and found extraordinary work that was being done, mostly with depressed women, both rural and urban settings, people who were extremely underprivileged, most of whom didn't recognize that they had an illness, who were recruited into these pilot studies and then received treatment, and who had extraordinary levels of transformation in their lives and got out of terrible marriages and got jobs and began to function and reconnected with their children. And it was they're extraordinary stories, and I won't take a lot of time on this stage to go into them because I know we have limited time. But I wrote the piece for the Times, and I turned it in, and I got a call from my editor a few days later, and she said, well, Andrew, we've read this, and, we really can't publish this. And I said, why? And she said, well, because it's just kind of implausible. I mean, I've never heard of such a thing before. You have these women who have all these problems, and then they have sort of 3 months of medication, and they're suddenly ready to become hedge fund managers. She said it just is, it's too over the top, and it doesn't make sense. And I said, the reason that you have never heard of it is because it is news. You are working at a news magazine. I said, the fact that it seems implausible to you is a sign of what an interesting story it is. And we eventually negotiated back and forth, and I did some rewriting of the piece, and it did ultimately run. But I just remember that conversation and that sense of it. In terms of other people writing more about these subjects, I think it's important to emphasize to your resistant editor, the ubiquity of this condition, and the fact that our knowledge of it is constantly changing. It hasn't changed to the point where we're now able to treat and cure depression very much better than we could when I wrote the original New Yorker piece. I mean, we have a few more medications and so on, but no major new breakthroughs really. But it's different to be depressed in 2017 or 2019 than it was to be depressed in 1994. And it's important to talk about how does it happen? How have the changes in stigma affected to people? What is the experience of mental illness today? It always needs updating. There's always something new. And every story is a unique and interesting story. And for a condition that affects this much of the population, getting out those unique and interesting stories broadens things and makes people feel connected when they're at their very, disease-motivated point of feeling completely disconnected.
Besides their worthiness, and by the way, if people want to line up for questions, we should begin doing that. Besides their worthiness, how do we make the stories better? I mean, in a way, you created a language for yourself that included you talking about yourself some, but also as a delivery system for the other material that maybe somebody wouldn't listen to if you were writing in the third person. So there's the issue of whether the subjects are worthy, which is an argument to have with our editors. There's also the issue of what the stories are supposed to look like, so that they would be readable not just to those of us who agree they should be written, but the people who don't get it. So I guess this is a pretty broad question, but how do we write stories that connect not only to the people in this room who are already doing this, but the people who truly don't understand?
Well, I think they need to be anchored, the stories that we tell. They need to be anchored in the reality of an individual person's experience. So, it's important to tell other people's stories, but it's important to contextualize them. It's crucial, actually, to have some sense that this is a story which is different from the other stories in X way and like the other stories in Y way. This is the universal experience of depression insofar as there is any such thing. This is what was specific to this case. This is why what was specific to this case is interesting. You have to structure an argument, and you will never find a typical case of depression. There are no typical cases. And so every time you write about depression, you're writing about atypical cases and trying through the narrative of those atypical cases to convey enough of the typical so that the story is useful to other people who are having their own individual experiences of illness.
We have a long line of questioners, so let's start taking some questions. Go ahead.
My question is about your writing process. How having, depression, how does that affect when you're writing about depression? Do you, you're steeping yourself in the material that is, it's like a blessing and a curse. So could you speak a little to your process and what you do when you have material that's difficult for you?
When I have material that's difficult for me, I think my tendency is to rush at it. I have a slightly counterphobic tendency and tend to move toward rather than away from difficult material. There are times when I feel like writing about depression is very cathartic, and sometimes I feel like it's helped me to heal. And sometimes what I've written that's helped me to heal is not really very good or interesting, and I try not to publish it out into the world. But writing is a way always for me to process things and gain some feeling of mastery or control over them. And I'm quite a controlling person, so that works well. And sometimes I'm working on a piece and I think this is too psychologically intense for me right now, and it's pushing me in a bad direction. I mean, I remember when I was working on the Adam Lanza piece that we talked about before, there were days when I thought, I have to take today off from Adam Lanza. I can't immerse myself in that material again. But that's part of an overall schema of recognizing my own sometime fragility and trying to avoid descending into that fragility all the time. I mean, I'm always, whatever I'm writing about or whatever I'm doing or whoever I'm seeing and so on and so forth, I feel like there's a need to be, mildly self-protective, sometimes acutely self-protective, sometimes not so much so.
So you're taking a mental health day?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, hi. I have a lot of questions, but I'll try and rein it in. So this is actually something Stephen had mentioned in the phrasing of one of his questions to you was about the learning curve. I think it was in reference to families that are struggling with the learning curve of their loved one's illness. And that struck something in me that I would love to ask you, because you are an educator and writer and person who has experienced these illnesses. Something that I've found in my both my attempt to report on mental health and also in treatment settings is that it's difficult sometimes to be a listener to other individuals who are struggling with these illnesses, who don't yet understand, or are really struggling with the learning curve of their particular illness and really don't understand what it means to be anxious, what it means to experience psychosis. And I'm wondering how you handle such confusion in an interview setting as both an educator and a person trying to listen.
So talking to people who don't yet understand their conditions, none of us ever understand these conditions. There is no understanding of these conditions. People come to understand more of the material that's sort of out in the commons. I think you have to reassure people that the condition that they're dealing with is one that has a lot of treatment, as most mental health complaints now do, not all, and that even without the treatment, people will cycle in and out of acute episodes. Certainly in depression, that's true. The psychotic disorders are more difficult to view in that way. But I think when you're dealing with someone in the situation you describe, that you need to provide them with hope. I don't know that as a journalist you need to provide them with hope. I think as a clinician you have to provide them with hope, because the optimism that it is possible to get better has sustained many people through enormous darkness. So I think you start from the standpoint of hope, and you also start from the standpoint of accommodation, and you say, our hope is that you will get better, and you should have that hope because what you have is treatable. But the reality is that even if it isn't treatable, these are the ways that you can build a life that has worth and that has meaning, in which you are just in touch with and aware of having this terrible condition. And then, and again, this moves away from journalism, but in my experience of people who have done relatively well with mental illnesses, the people who have got support structure around them often do better than the people who don't have many supports around them. So if those supports are there, you have to be able to say to someone, you have such a close relationship with your family, you have such a close relationship with your wife, whatever it is, you stand a good chance of getting better. Try to be open about what you're going through with that person insofar as that person can tolerate it.
Sorry, can I just follow up?
Very briefly.
Okay, sorry. But I am curious, as a journalist, when you're interviewing someone who is clearly grappling with basic understanding of their illness, how, I guess, the urge to help and educate as a knowledgeable person? How do you kind of navigate those situations?
If you are interviewing someone, especially someone who's suffering from an acute mental illness, you're making an enormous demand on someone else. And I don't really believe in the idea of journalistic neutrality. I think it's important, if you have knowledge or information that can be helpful, that you offer that and that you make the conversation a two-way street. That being said, you should never be offering information that's outside your real base of knowledge. And if you're a journalist rather than a clinician, you shouldn't really be saying, you know, I've heard so-and-so is really useful, or what about this medication or that medication. You should contain what you say to the area in which you have knowledge, and you should always encourage the person you're talking to, especially if you're talking to someone you feel is getting suboptimal care, to seek out better care, or to seek care at all if they're not pursuing care. But I think reciprocity is deeply appropriate.
Great, thank you.
Go ahead.
Hi. We've seen each other before. So I'd actually like to pose a question that asks you to make a statement that really is the theme of Far From the Tree. And because I think you're very intentional, and I think the fact that you left out Noonday Demon and did mention a lot about your work from Far From the Tree, there's an extraordinary dialectic that you pose that I think all of us as we're all family members, okay? Not all of us have had direct experience, you know, a lot of people have not had direct experience with psychoses, okay? But you mentioned that, and actually I'd like you to just sort of take it from here, but it was something about the role of unconditional love, and that a child, and it's not about identity politics, it's about actual identity, that a child who is in a family that is trying to cure an illness feels extremely marginalized and isolated because their very identity is something that is somehow unsound or needs to be eliminated. And that if the family can understand the profoundness of that identity and embrace it with unconditional love, that child feels included, and it's a game changer, it's transformational. That meant a lot to me. Could you elaborate on that, because you've spoken hours on it before and it meant so much to the audience?
Well, look, unconditional love is really, really, really helpful. It's not really useful as a clinician to be able to say to someone, you know, the only problem you really have is that nobody loves you, and find some people who love you.
No,
it feels so much better. So that's kind of difficult. I've written a lot about families. I think acceptance has to occur at three levels. There's self-acceptance, there's family acceptance, and there's acceptance by the larger society, and each of them feeds the other. So someone who has really good self-acceptance is going to have a much easier time convincing his family. But if that family lives in a context of larger social acceptance, that too will make it easier for them to accept their child. The question of illness and identity is, you know, absolutely central to everything that I do. I think many things, as I said before, can be described as either illnesses or identities, and many things can be described as both illnesses and identities. And I think it's helpful to parents not to minimize the pain of what they're going through, you know, not to say, well, your daughter is suddenly ravingly incoherent, and you should just think of that as part of her identity and who she is. You know, that's not an appropriate position to take. But to acknowledge for people who are actually dealing with these difficulties that they have an identity, and that that identity is to some reasonable degree vested in this experience that's also of illness, is to give someone a sense of him or herself as a whole person. I mean, I started off this conversation by saying one of the things that interested me was how some people with mild depression did worse than some people with what seemed like more significant depression. And part of the mechanism of that, I think, is that these are cyclical illnesses. They are things that recur. They are things that require, in most instances, if not in all, long-term management. If you wall yourself off from the terrible experience that you've had and say, I never want to think about it again, then when it recurs, it disrupts your entire life narrative. If you take a sense that this is part of your life, that it may or may not come back, but that in any event you're prepared for it and you acknowledge the experiences you have had as part of your life, it doesn't make the depression any less horrible when it comes along, but it makes it much easier to tolerate it. You think, yes, this is this thing I've done and I have to do it again now, and I think I'm up to it.
Hi, I'm going to ask a personal question, so I'm going to give a real brief personal introduction. My name is Juliet. I'm an undergrad at UPenn. I study mostly English and a little bit of neuroscience. And my writing partner, Bridget, is here with me too, and we started a website, and we talk a lot about mental health. And I do a lot of reading and research on it my own. I work in labs and all that stuff. But I have severe depression, right? And I take medicine, and I've been blessed with a really supportive family, a really great support network. I have so much esteem for my therapist. I have all these coping mechanisms and whatever. But, you you touched on the fact that there are still bad days when you were talking. And my bad days, or if I have a bad week or a bad month or something, especially when school's in session, it necessitates me, I get really proud of myself if I get out of bed and take a shower in the morning, right? So it's hard for me to commit to writing for actual organizations, because I don't know how to write when I'm having really bad days or really bad weeks. So how do you personally write through that depression and find that energy or motivation?
I don't write when I'm having really bad days. I write when I'm having a slightly better day. The really bad days you can't write. The depression is completely disabling, and I agree with you. If you can get out of bed and take a shower, that's a major triumph. And I've had many days when I couldn't get out of bed and I couldn't take a shower and I couldn't write a word. Virginia Woolf said, "Take notes and the pain goes away." And I think it's when you look at these things retrospectively and you think, that felt like such a barren, terrible stretch of my life. But now I'm past it, and instead of ignoring it, I'm going to write about it. That somehow redeems the time that you've lost to depression and says there was something to be learned there, and I have learned it. And so it's very redemptive to be able to do that. But it's not appropriate or possible to force yourself to do that in the throes of major depression or of many other aspects of significant mental illness.
Just a quick follow-up. So hypothetically, if you were working for an organization or something and you had a deadline to meet and you'd been having really bad days up until that deadline, what would you do? Because you can't just not turn something in, right? You can't just quit your job because you're struggling.
Well, it depends how much you're struggling. And it depends, I guess, on how the schedule, if you're struggling, coincides with or interacts with the schedule of your job. We do have, in theory, laws that say that you're allowed to take sick days for having a mental illness, and that you're not supposed to be able to do that without prejudice. The reality is that if you kind of are constantly missing things because you're depressed, people eventually move on and they don't want you working there. I think, it's dangerous to push yourself so hard that you escalate what you're dealing with. It can also be dangerous to sit back so much and say, I can't do anything until I'm feeling better, and allow weeks and weeks to go by when nothing happens. As you point out, if you have a job that doesn't work very well, you have to push yourself to function as well as you can, and accept that in some instances you won't be able to function as well as people would like you to. And you have to, that's the reality. I wish I could say there's this thing you do and then it doesn't matter anymore. You have to balance it, and you have to be honest with yourself about what you're really capable of doing, and you have to seek out help if there are areas in which you can get help that will allow you to function better in a professional context.
Thank you.
Have you ever had a situation where you could not function professionally and had to tell an editor that, or pull out of a project, or?
What's bizarre is that I've had that experience on numerous occasions, and I feel like I've written this whole book on depression, and when it comes to not being able to function well like that, I get embarrassed all over again, and I don't want to tell my editor that that's what it is. And I say, I'm so sorry that I'm missing this, but I've had this horrible food poisoning I got somehow. I just can't seem to get over it, and so on and so forth. And when I'm not depressed, I can talk very readily about being depressed, but when I am depressed, it feels very private, and I want to hide it from people.
Are there other good ones besides food poisoning that have been successful for you?
Anemia, pancreatic cancer. One can go on and on.
We can take one more question, and then we're going to have to end up. Go ahead.
All right, I'll make it quick. I have a question about writing more about your own personal experiences. I really connected with what you said about how sometimes when you're disclosing, there can be that initial fear, but sometimes when you're letting yourself talk about something and you haven't previously, you just get so into it so quickly that not only does it get, messy and embarrassing, but it gets so self-involved that it's kind of at the detriment of what you want to do with the piece. So I guess my question is, how do you kind of apply like that journalistic objectivity to your own experiences, or do you just like try to find really good editors?
Well, I think the trick is to be a really good editor. I think you should write down everything you're thinking and feeling, if you can, and write it out in that way, and then let it sit for a few days and come back to it and think which parts of this actually will be compelling and helpful to other people, and which are the parts that really are just my own scribbling for my own purposes. I mean, The Noonday Demon is a thick book, but I eliminated at least half of the material that I'd written for it, including a lot of the autobiographical material that I'd written. And I think you have to have a sort of rigorous standard of self-editing, and sometimes if you feel you can't see your way through, then ask someone else to look at it and say, are there parts of this that seem to you to drag? Are there parts of it that you don't understand? Are there parts of it that are too chaotic? I think clarity is what everybody wants in depression. The experience of depression is the experience of being in this terrible muck. And one of the symptoms of depression, and it's a symptom that I have had. I had it last year when I had this depression last year. One of the symptoms is feeling like you will never get better. That is a symptom of depression. It is not merely a sort of negative conviction that some people arrive at. So how do you get out of the morass and come to some kind of clarity? People who are depressed really want a clear note of sort of, this is part of what will happen, this is part of what will happen, this is part of what will happen. They want diagnosis, they want treatment, and they want to have a sense of what it will look like to be well again. And often you can give people access to all of those things by describing how you arrived at them yourself. But I think you have to have a certain measure of clarity before you can be helpful to others.
That's a great place to end. I want to thank Andrew Solomon for coming today.
Thank you.